Hey guys, it's Mountain Walk, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about more pre-modern decks. That's right, another tournament thingy. This should be interesting. This one has 43 players, right? 42 players, so close. Yeah, this is definitely pretty sweet. A lot of cool stuff today to talk about, to look at. So let's get started. Okay, so first off, we have Parfait. Again, most of the stuff is pretty standard. Even things like Aura Fracture and Aegis of Honor are pretty, they're liable to show up, likely to show up in deck lists, and yeah, nothing too strange there. Back to Basics is a little bit more uncommon, but again, a pretty sweet card when, you're playing with, well, basic lands, Mox Diamond, Undiscovered Paradise, right? And of course, Iridescent Angel, definitely one that's not super duper common, but I've seen before in Parfait lists. And it's a pretty sweet card to oath out. Pretty hard to kill. Definitely, well, she has protection from all colors, so obviously that entails quite a bit of durability. Pretty big amount of resilience. Pretty sweet card. I definitely remember getting one of those back in the day, thinking like, man, what a sweet card. But well, it is what it is. It's okay here. So yeah, good stuff, good stuff. All right, and now we got some really cool stuff, a madness deck, but also with a bunch of survival stuff thrown in, and of course a lot of graveyard recursion kind of things like Krovikan Horror and Recurring Nightmare. Zombie Infestation, of course, is quite good with Squee, and to fetch up all the Squees, or even something like Krovikan Horror, you have Buried Alive, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot of sweet stuff going on here, a lot of cool things. So you can, use survival with all your different madness cards, right? Like Basking Root Wall and Arrogant Worm and such. And then of course you have survival specific things like Genesis, right, as a survival target. Withered Wretch is a survival target, that kind of stuff. So yeah, a lot of really cool things. Obviously, Cabal Therapy. Cabal Therapy, good with Korvikan Horror, stuff that wants to come back, all sorts of things. So yeah, definitely a lot of really cool things going on here. A bunch of stuff in the sideboard. Again, additional tutor targets like Plague Spitter, Bottle Gnomes, so on and so forth. And mostly just a lot of interaction to cover up holes where the main deck cards, even though you can have answers to it, they're a lot slower. Think of like, things like, Utabi Orangutan or whatever versus artifacts versus having naturalized, being able to just cast it and that kind of thing. So, yeah, pretty sweet deck, pretty sweet deck. Okay, and now we have Landstill. This is the most Landstill list that ever existed. It's just Landstill. I guess maybe the Wrath on the board is a little unusual, right? A little bit different, but typically you got your standstills, got your counter magic, got your two disenchants right in the main deck. Random forbid, Voss, lands. Yeah, I mean this one doesn't have any wastelands. It has Dust Bowl instead. And again, I think generally Dust Bowl is just better. I kind of like a split, but I also think like two Dust Bowl isn't bad. But either or, pretty typical Landstill list. Not a lot to see here. Very stock. All right, and for something a little bit spicier, we have the Solution or Patriot or whatever you want to call it. This is basically more similar to Landstill in some respects, it just being a bigger sort of mid-range deck, more like a control deck, honestly, that plays Lightning Angel and Exalted Angel main deck. Yeah, you got a lot of stuff like Fire and Ice, right? Bolt, right, as additional removal. Um, the mana base certainly reflects playing three colors. The only thing I'm not a huge fan of, I think I'd maybe rather just play another Coastal Tower instead of Grand Coliseum. I mean, Coliseum has like all the drawbacks of like a tap land and a pain land, so I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't think you probably don't want three pools. A Reflecting Pool is one of those cards where it's like it's can smooth out your mana, but also can be not great. So I think two pool is definitely where you'd want to be, and obviously something like Gemstone Mine doesn't really work. But I think in general, I'd probably rather have another Coastal Tower. Yeah. And of course, you got a Necroma's Vengeance. That's kind of a neat card. Good against, well, decks with a lot of artifacts and enchantments, and also good against creature decks. And when it's not good at all, you can cycle it. So that's pretty great. I like that a lot. Definitely might be something to look into, playing more of these guys. One or two more. One more, I should say. Like 2 Vengeance seems pretty strong, but in general, it's, 6 mana is obviously quite a bit. So, anyways, this is a pretty interesting deck. Basically one of the like the blue, red, white sort of like mid-rangey sort of style decks, but going a little bit slower. And you get cool stuff like Pyroblast in the sideboard, which is obviously a very good card, good against the control mirrors and things like that. So yeah, definitely pretty sweet stuff. Pretty sweet stuff. Definitely pretty cool deck. Nice take. Nice take. Okay, and now we have a rock style sort of list, or it says Rex or Rock, but it's basically just a survival deck, more or less. Look at all those 1-outs. This is such a survival deck. It's surviving so much. We even got a 61 card special. Certainly with all these tutors and such, you can take advantage of the additional tutor targets, which is obviously quite good. So I think that's certainly a defensible choice. Lots of cool stuff here. I mean, you got Therapy and Duress, right? These are, typical sort of mid-range aggro sort of staples. Especially if you have a lot of creatures. In the case of Cabal Therapy, you can really disrupt your opponent. Very sweet. The cards obviously work very good together. But in addition, we of course have all the survival 1-ofs and all that kind of stuff. And this deck is going hard. We got like 3 and Quarry of all things. Obviously works in a survival deck because you have so many creatures. Tons of fetch lands, City of Brass. Definitely pretty interesting mana base. It looks pretty well thought out. Obviously, like, you can only have so many lands, so many basics or whatever, but the foothills and things like that, the fetch lands in general, help smooth things out because they can fetch 2 different basics. So like one foothills can get you your mountain, or it can get you more forests, or your polluted delta can get you your 1 island or multiple swamps. So there's a lot going on there where it's kind of an interesting interaction where you don't want too many of each, but like 1 or 2 do some pretty good mana fixing, right? Speaking of the fetch lands in particular, got some pain lands in there. A lot of really cool stuff going on with the mana. Again, like the Opposition and Worship, they're good cards to tutor into. They're good cards to Academy Rector into. Worship just being very strong against, well, decks that can't remove it pre-board or even post-board is still pretty good. Opposition just being good against everything. Once you have enough crap in play, you can completely lock your opponent out of the game. Obviously, it's just a little slow, but as a 1-of, being able to be tutored for, very strong here. Big fan of that. A lot of good stuff in the sideboard. Pernicious Deeds, right? Really leading into that sort of mid-range rock kind of game plan. Deed, of course, is very good against a bunch of different stuff. It's good for grinding. It's good for hitting all sorts of random crap. You have a bunch of tutor targets, right? Sharpshooter, definitely a popular, excellent survival target. Spore Frog, right? You can Genesis Frog lock people. Withered Wretch, Gilded Drake, Baloth, and of course a Null Rod to tutor for, especially with your additional Enlightened Tutor in the board. E-Plague, I mean, just tons of good stuff. Lots and lots of really interesting stuff going on here. Really cool. I like this a lot. A lot of really cool choice. I mean, some of the choices are like, yeah, these are cards that I've always seen play in survival decks, but there's a lot of mixing and matching of different deck building components. Like, oh, you got this part of the rock with your Mana Dorks and your Therapy and Duress and your Pernicious Deeds, and you have this part of survival decks, like all your tutors and your survival, and then you have like Enlightened Tutor stuff where you have, your random 1-of enchantments and stuff on the board that you can tutor for, and so on and so forth. But yeah, real cool stuff. Pretty neat deck. Okay, and now we have Tog, and this is a fairly, well, not a typical list, but this is a list that has been seen before. Going super hard on the just basic lands. very few non-basics. Um, yeah, I feel like this deck does need at least another Underground River or maybe two, especially with things like Duress and E-Plague. You pretty much always want the ability to slam E-Plague on 3 or maybe even sometimes Duress on turn 1 consistently. Uh, so those are probably something I would look into. Cut like another island or two for Underground River. And along the same lines, playing all these basic lands really incentivizes you to play something like Back to Basics, which is again not something that typically most control decks have access to. Tog certainly does, because, well, it's kind of already incentivized to play a lot of islands anyways due to things like Gush or some number of Gush. And then you only really need black mana for consistently, at least in late game, for Tog. So having some number of swamps to draw into or whatever is fine. Um, Again, it's a little wonkier when you have things like Cunning Wish and you're wishing for black cards, say like the Snuff Out or Shallow Grave or something like that. But the Shallow Grave is less of an issue because then it's like, oh, you just, late game you can do it and it's fine because you're recurring like a killed or countered Tog. But um, yeah, I would say one or two more Underground River. I think that would be pretty great. But also, 20 lands does feel a little bit too ambitious with this sort of style of deck, even with all the cantrips. I've been, a lot happier with 22, 23, or even 24. 24th land could be something like Sepulchre Coliseum, which is pretty sweet, but because it's still like sort of a spell in some respects. But anyways, a lot of good stuff here though. You get your sideboard like Cunning Wish targets plus Duress and E-Plague, which are very, very good against, well, the decks are good against anything like super heavy on instants and sorceries, combo decks, control decks, even some mid-range decks. Duress is great against. E-Plague is pretty obvious where that's good against. But yeah, I like the main deck too, pretty good. Opt is unfortunately like a little bit weak, but it's a fine card. Opt. Mental Note, definitely a pretty sweet one. Force Spike and Daze. Daze especially is uncommon, especially with all the pressure Gush is putting on your deck list, but I think playing 1 or 2 days is fine because of the psychic damage, I guess, for lack of a better word, like Aspiring Spike would say. What happens is, like, especially if people get dazed once by your deck, especially if they don't expect you to play dazed, they'll oftentimes play around it all the time. So, and Force Spike is sort of like that, but Force Spike is a little bit different, where it's like both cards are obviously better on the play, but Spike is a little bit more telegraphed, uh, but it's obviously a little bit easier to hardcast for obvious reasons, right? 1 versus 2 mana. So I think these are both interesting options. I would lean more along the lines of playing Force Spike instead, rather than Daze, just because like you want to hit your land drops, especially with decks that wants to cast as many spells as it can all the time. Yeah, so Force Spike is pretty sweet, pretty strong, and of course you can just set up your counter wall from turn 1 onwards, which is very good, very useful. Can save you a ton of life versus aggressive decks. And of course, the only other thing I don't like that's not in the sideboard would be something like no Haunting Echoes, not 1 or 2 Echoes. Echoes is an excellent additional win condition, as well as just completely operating on an axis that Tog doesn't really, right? Obviously, Tog is like you play a Psychic Tog and you're vulnerable to creature removal and Red Elemental Blast and things like that, whereas something like Haunting Echoes is a sorcery and doesn't care about the graveyard, or your graveyard, I should say, and you can't Red Blast it and so on. And it plays very well with all of your main game plan, which is countering and killing whatever stuff that they play. So yeah, interesting stuff there. Also, again, yeah, Back to Basics should probably be in here too. But yeah, lots of cool stuff. Definitely a pretty sweet deck. Big fan of it. Okay, and now we have more or less more of the same. I feel like unless it's a budget choice, you should probably be playing the 8 fetch lands in general, just because it's another free card in your graveyard, which is quite nice. This one does have Back to Basics in the sideboard, but we still see a lot of things like Beb and Snuff Out. I think the previous list had Beb in the sideboard. Can't remember. Sabo's Decree, right? Sabo's Decree being very good against things like elves and goblins and stuff, especially against those other two decks. Well, especially against those two decks, I should say, because they can create a big board as well as have additional cards in hand to rebuild. So Decree is definitely very sweet there. Most of the rest is all pretty standard. Again, we got no duress in the main deck, or excuse me, in the sideboard. Also not in the main deck either, I just noticed. But yeah, we have E-Plague and Back to Basics and all sorts of sweet stuff. So yeah, not much else to say here. Pretty standard. Well, I guess I don't want to say standard because all the lists tend to be pretty different, but a lot of really cool stuff here. All right, and the deck that wins is just Terrageddon. Nothing strange here. I can't remember if they in general play Mulch. I mean, I think Mulch is very good in this deck. It's like card advantage. It's additional, ways to put more crap in the graveyard. It gets you things like, cycle lands and man lands and all sorts of things like that. Really sweet card. Big fan of that. Gets you obviously closer to Threshold, right? Puts Riftstone Portal in the graveyard. Oh boy. Yeah, so it's good for things like Mongoose and Werebear and so on. And of course Terravore. And of course Sylvan, I can't even talk today. Sylvan Library, sweet card, definitely really cool. Definitely should be a 2 or 3 of in these kind of decks. Just so much card advantage, so much good card advantage, especially if you got like a big old Terravore or whatever, or if they plow your Terravore, you can have so much life to dig with the Sylvan Library. Obviously, Sylvan itself is good with fetch lands too, and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, definitely a lot of really cool stuff here. Nothing too strange. Got your Cataclysms, got your Armageddons and so on, Mox Diamonds, yada yada yada. Pretty stock list overall. But yeah, Mulch, I love it. Definitely very good in this deck. Sylvan Library, I love it. Typically played as a 1 or 2 of in this deck. May even need to bump that up to 3. I've always been kind of like unsure about that, but I did always liked 1 or 2 Sylvan Library and Terrageddon when I was playing it. So yeah, there you go. But that's about it for today, guys. So yeah, just looking at this sweet 40 something person tournament, 42. Lots of cool cards, lots of cool decks, some interesting innovation as per usual, which is pretty sweet. So don't give up, guys. Keep tuning, keep spicing up your decks, keep making cool stuff, and we're gonna make it. We're gonna make it. We're gonna make the best decks of all time. So yeah, that's it for today, guys. So thanks for stopping by, and have a great day.